Welcome to Neuroanatomy Part 1. This is going to be a lot of fun. I know this topic is very extensive, but it's very important to understand it and know it because this is going to be the foundation where we're going to be built up on for future topics like mapping, semiology, seizure localization, when we talk about the homunculus and evoked potentials. So make sure that you have a good foundation and then everything else is going to be easier. So to start with, I want to mention the parts of our central nervous system. And as you can see in this picture, there's something called neocortex. This is just the same as cortex. But the reason why I picked this picture is because I want you to get familiar with this term. Neocortex is the same as cortex, as we know as cortex. But they're going to put it like this in your test because you're going to see that there are neocortical seizures. Okay, so neocortex is for higher order thinking, and then we have the limbic system, which is in charge of emotions, and then the brainstem, which is for survival, for the heartbeat, for respirations, just to keep us alive. And then we start with the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain and is composed of the right and the left hemisphere. We all know, I'm pretty confident that by now we all know what are the four lobes of the brain, and that's frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. And even if you didn't take an anatomy class before you became a technologist, when you started doing EEGs, you had to learn the electrode placement with the 1020 and the nomenclature. So by now, I'm pretty sure that you know the lobes. What I want to mention is main functions of each lobe. And I just want to make clear, I want to be clear in that some of the functions in these lobes might overlap. So what I'm going to mention is the main functions, the ones that you have to be looking for when you get a case, a patient with certain type of symptoms. Then you want to think about what are the main functions of each lobe. So for example, the frontal lobe is the largest lobe of the brain, and this one is highly connected with the adjacent lobes. And this is the function, the main functions are concentration, planning, judgment, emotional expression, and creativity. And then we have the parietal lobe that we know is for sensory. Sensation from muscle and skin are going to go to the parietal lobe in the cortex. And then we have the temporal lobe, which is for short-term memory, equilibrium, and emotion. And then occipital lobe, we all know that is for visual, where our visual field is sight, image recognition, and perception. And then there's another structure that I want to mention that is considered to be a lobe, but it's inner in the brain. It's not in the cortex, and that's the insula. And insula is the Latin word for island. So you're going to see these two structures. You can look it up on each hemisphere. And it's just two little islands, and these are going to be related to understanding and interpreting our emotions, the way that we react to things. So this structure is going to be in close relation with the limbic system, which is the one that is in control of our emotions. And this image that I added here is just for your reference. You can go back to it. You're going to have this presentation available to you, the PowerPoint. Um, but just to mention some of the structures here or areas that are colored, you're going to see that this is the frontal lobe, and then we have the cingulate gyrus. This is a medial view of the hemisphere. So you're not looking at on the side profile, which is the lateral view. You're looking at the medial view. And this is the cingulate gyrus that is surrounding the corpus callosum, which is the interconnection between hemispheres, and or the network between both hemispheres. and then the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, and then you have in here you have the sensory strip and then the motor strip. Sensory strip in blue, motor strip in yellow. Just know that it's here. You can go back to it and read each thing. But because I'm going to be mentioning the structures throughout this presentation, I don't want to take time going over each thing on that one. So in the cerebrum, we're going to find the cortex, and the cortex is the surface of the cerebrum, and it's misspelled here. It's gray matter. So the gray color that you see of the brain when you dissect a cadaver. I know we don't do that, but if you see a brain, a real brain, you see that it's grayish in color. And even though for some reason we always see it um, like a piece of meat in illustrations and it looks kind of pinkish, it's really grayish. And it's because of the nerve endings, the axons, the terminals of the axons that give it that color. So it's gray matter. And what I want you to take from this slide is these symptoms that the patient might present are localizing for some of these areas. So for example, we have the supplementary motor cortex. And in this case, they said posturing. And these are from questions that I saw in some Q banks. And for example, posturing, when they mention posturing, you're going to think about frontal lobe. And in the frontal lobe, but inner in the frontal lobe, is the supplementary motor cortex. So the supplementary motor cortex is right here under the premotor cortex. So you see it here, the premotor cortex, and under is the supplementary motor cortex. So if they say posturing, and this is one of the choices, you want to pick supplementary motor cortex. The supplementary motor cortex, as it's saying here, it's good for programming complex movements, where the premotor cortex is good for the coordination of that complex movement. So for example, if you have a cup of coffee on your desk and you want to take a sip of the coffee, the first thing that is going to happen is that you're going to think about it, right? And you're going to start programming your brain for, okay, I want a sip of my coffee. And then that's going to be connected to the premotor cortex that is going to be in charge of coordinating the movement of your hand towards to reach the cup of coffee. So they are both connected. But if you see posturing and supplementary motor cortex is one of the choices, that's the right answer. And then for simple movement like twitching, you're going to think of that motor strip on the frontal lobe, and it's going to be contralateral. So if they say something is twitching, a muscle on the left is twitching, you're going to think of the precentral gyrus or the motor cortex or the primary motor cortex, which is on the frontal lobe and on the contralateral side. And then if they say visual hallucination, automatically you're going to think about the occipital lobe. And if they say something about sensory disturbances, like numbness, tingling, you're going to think about parietal lobe and where the sensory cortex is. And another thing we have in the brain is gyri. So you know that our brain is not a smooth surface. It has these folds, these foldings. And what this does is that it creates a larger surface area. So for example, if you were to take a brain that is like a compact mass and you were able to cut the gyri, you're going to see how you're going to expand it. And from a mass this big, you can have like, it's like, I don't know if you ever seen a placenta in real life, but it's gonna be kind of something like that. But whatever. The point is that the gyrus or the gyri, what does is that it makes more surface area in less space. So this is going to enable for higher functions. There's going to be more neurons in there and higher functions. So each fold is going to be called a gyrus, and plural is gyri. And then there are grooves that are between the folds that are going to be called sulcus or fissures. So the frontal and temporal lobe both have 3 gyri, and that's the superior, middle, and inferior gyri. And then the occipital lobe has the superior, inferior, and lateral. And the parietal lobe only has superior and inferior. And then we have the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus, which are the motor and sensory strip, respectively. Here is just an image or a drawing of a brain with the lobes, the frontal lobe in yellow, the temporal lobe in green, pinkish or red is the parietal, and then the blue is the occipital lobe. And you can see the gyri in each one. And just to mention other structures that are here that I didn't mention as part of like the gyri, is the angularis gyrus that we're going to see in a minute, and supramarginalis in the parietal region. And then on the inferior part of the frontal lobe, we have other, um, it's it's gyri. It's not gyri, it's other structures right there. But just if you want to learn the names, but it's not really important for the CLTM. So the important thing for the CLTM is the function of each gyrus, and these ones are the ones that I think are the most important ones. And I didn't mention any of these other than angular gyrus on the previous picture because these are more deeper in the brain. This is a medial structure. These you have to open, separate that sylvian fissure to be able to see it. And the fusiform is also a medial structure. And the angular gyrus is the one that we saw in the previous image. So the cingulate gyrus, we're going to discuss that when we talk about the limbic system. But this one is the one that surrounds the corpus callosum. So it has like a C shape surrounding the corpus callosum, and it regulates emotions. Remember, it is part of the limbic system. It's also in regulating, no, in pain perception and cognitive functions like attention, decision making. So some of these things might be related to the frontal lobe too. And then we have the Heschel gyrus, and this one is very important. You're going to see 1 or 2 questions or 3, I don't know how many, on Heschel gyrus. And Heschel gyrus, just remember, is primary auditory cortex. Primary auditory cortex. And another thing you need to know is that it's laying on that superior transverse temporal gyri, or its another name is superior transverse temporal gyrus. So it's laying there on the superior temporal lobe, okay, on the superior part of the temporal lobe. Those are the two things you need to know about Heschel gyrus. So if they say something about auditive stimulation or any reactivity to auditory stimulus, you're going to think about Heschel gyrus, and it's located in the superior portion of the temporal lobe, and it's the primary auditory cortex. And then we have the fusiform gyrus, and this one you can find it in the occipital temporal gyrus, and it's for face recognition. So I don't know if this is gonna help you at all, but face recognition, iPhone, your phone right now gotta have the function of face recognition. So face recognition, fusiphone. I don't know if that makes sense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to make sense. You either memorize it as face recognition on the fusiform, or you remember the fusiphone and phone. And then we have the angular gyrus, which is in the somatosensory area of the parietal lobe, and it's important for language function, number processing, spatial recognition, memory retrieval, and attention. So for this one, if you see a question that is asking about mathematics, math operations. Just think about parietal. So any structure in the parietal lobe. So even if they don't say parietal lobe, but you see that there's angular gyrus, which is part of your parietal lobe, which what is going to be your answer? It's going to be that angular gyrus. So remember, math, parietal lobe. And here is the medial aspect of the hemisphere, and this is just for you to see the fusiform gyrus for face recognition, the cingulate gyrus, which is for emotions and pain perception and other things, that is part of the limbic system and is surrounding the corpus callosum. Right there is the cingulate gyrus. And this is just a graphical representation of the Heschel gyrus. And it's just for you to see that it's very deep in the brain. It's not superficial. It's going to be rare if you can pick up activity, electrical activity from this portion of the brain on surface electrodes. So you will have to separate the Sylvian fissure to be able to see the Heschel gyrus. But it's right there, as I said before. It's the primary auditory cortex, and is in the superior portion of the temporal lobe. Okay, it's lying right there by the Wernicke's area. Seizures, we already mentioned something about that. Well, we saw that the gyri are the folding, and fissures are the deep grooves that separate um, lobes. In this case, the medial longitudinal fissure does not separate lobes, but it separates the right from the left hemisphere. Okay, and I don't know if you remember what is the structure that connects the hemispheres is the corpus callosum, and the fissure is the one that separates the hemispheres. Rolandic fissure, we also call it central sulcus, and this is very important for when we talk about evoked potentials. And this one separates the frontal and the parietal lobes. And you might know that we have Rolandic seizures, and Rolandic seizures, you're gonna see it in that central, in that vertex, right? We're gonna see it in C4, the discharges are going to be C3 or C4 and CZ. And then we have Sylvian fissure, which are lateral fissure, also called lateral fissure. So that one is laying horizontally. Rolandic fissure is laying vertically. And this one separates the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobe. In the test or Q-bank, you might see that they say separates the frontal from the temporal. That's also right. If there's no option with the frontal and parietal lobes separating from the temporal lobe, then that's going to be the right answer. If they tell you it separates the parietal from the temporal, it's also right. But if you have these answer, then that's the best answer because it separates the temporal lobe from the ones that are on top of it, which are the frontal and parietal lobes. Then we have the Broca's area. And the Broca's area is located right here in the inferior frontal gyrus. Is usually on the left. Why is that? The Broca's area and Wernicke's area both are usually on the left because this is where language is produced and processed, and it's usually on the dominant side, on the dominant hemisphere or the dominant brain. How do we know it's mostly in the left? It's because most of our patients and the population is right-handed, and that indicates that the dominant side is the left. So Wernicke's and Broca's areas are usually going to be on the left. So the Broca's area is important in the production of written and spoken language, and that's expressive speech. So when we have damage on the Broca's area, we're going to have aphasia, Broca's aphasia, or expressive aphasia. And why is that? That's because If it's damaged, then you cannot produce speech. It's hard. You need a lot of effort to produce speech, even though you can understand it. The problem is in the motor area. Broca, it's part of the frontal lobe, and that's the motor area, right? So the problem here is that the broca, think about in Spanish, mouth is boca. So think about your mouth is broken. Mouth is broken and you cannot speak what you want to say. Your mouth is broken, your boca is broken. So that's going to be expressive aphasia. You cannot express even though you know what you want to say. Now, Wernicke's area is going to be laying on the posterior portion of the superior temporal gyrus, also on the left hemisphere most of the times. And if it's, this is for receptive speech and word comprehension. So what you're hearing, you're understanding it, and what you say makes sense, right? So if this is damaged, then you're gonna present with receptive aphasia. You don't understand what the people are talking, and you cannot make sense of your own words. So Wernicke, remember, broca, boca in Spanish is broken, um, your mouth is broken, and Wernicke's is what? So think about the W on Wernicke's and the W in what? Because the patient is not able to comprehend what is being spoken to them, and they cannot make sense of their own words. And Brodmann's area, this is something that I just want you to learn these, but if you have time and you want to learn all of them, it's okay too. So basically, this is just a physician that decided that the structure, like the microscopic structure of these separate areas, he grouped them together. So um, also, I don't know if this is gonna help you memorize it, but I'm just gonna tell you. So area 22, which is, if I can see well, 22 is in the superior temporal gyrus, and this includes the Wernicke's area. So it's important for processing sounds and comprehension of speech. So 22, at 22, you don't even know, you're not making sense, you don't know what you're saying. Let's say that you're ignorant, right? Because when you're older and you look back, you're like, at 22, I was just, I don't know. And then when you're 41 or 42, and you have a spouse and children, you develop something that is called selective hearing. So let's think about primary auditory cortex, which is the Heschel gyrus that I told you about. So that's area, Brodmann's area 41 and 42. Remember, at 41, 42, married with kids, selective hearing. So that's your Brodmann area 41 and 42 with the primary auditory cortex with the Heschel gyrus, first relay station of auditory information in the cortex. And then at 45, 44, 45, we're broke. So Broca's area is right here, 44 and 45. At that age, we're broke. Not like our parents that are already at 44, 45. They had um, everything that they needed and debts paid. But for us now, we're broke with all the student loans and everything. So Broca's area is associated with speech production and articulation. So that's your Brodmann areas. That's all you need to know for the test. Don't stress about it. Now let's go deeper into the brain. So we have deep structures that are the white matter. So we talked about the gray matter. Now the white matter is what is white because it's mostly the myelin on the neurons, right? So the myelin is like a fatty thing that surrounds the axons of our neurons, and that's our white matter. So these deep structures include the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is related to autonomic functions and control survival elements such as hunger, thirst, emotions, blood pressure, body temperature, sex drive, and reproduction, including hormone release in conjunction with the pituitary gland. And then we have the thalamus, and the thalamus is the relay station from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system and vice versa. So all the information goes to the thalamus and it gets sent to where it needs to go in the cortex. And then from the cortex goes back to the thalamus and onto whatever part of the body that needs to move or whatever the function might be. And then we have the basal ganglia, and this is basal ganglia is gray matter, but it's located deep within the white matter, and it controls muscle tone, fine motor movement, and posture. So basal ganglia is going to be affected in diseases like Parkinson's. And um, basal ganglia, when you hear the word ganglia, it's just a group of nuclei. So there are like 3 different nuclei together in the basal ganglia. And then you have the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland, we know that is in charge of hormone release and control. So it's connected to the hypothalamus, and it's the master gland. It regulates other glands, secretes hormones that control sexual development, promote bone and muscle growth, and responds to stress. And then we have the pineal gland. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. So this one helps with the circadian rhythm, with the um, waking and going to sleep, the melatonin. You know that the brain has the pineal gland that when it's dark, it's going to release melatonin so you can go to sleep. And then when it's bright, then it inhibits the release of melatonin. And that happens in the pineal gland that is in charge of the circadian rhythm. Now, the limbic system is the one that is controlling emotions. And we talked a little bit about hypothalamus, but hypothalamus is mostly for hormone release and homeostasis. So there's no like a consensus on what structures should be involved in the limbic system, because if you say limbic system, you're going to think about emotions. But some of the things that the hypothalamus does, it's related to the limbic system. But most of the limbic system is about emotions. Hippocampus, sorry that I keep messing up. Hippocampus is the one that has to do with memory and learning. And then we have the amygdala, which is the fearful and anxious emotions. And then we have the parahippocampal gyrus. I think I showed you on the image before, and the cingulate gyrus also for emotions and memory. And then the mammillary bodies. If you see this question in the CLTM, it's going to be related to a patient that is alcoholic, that has riboflavin or vitamin B1 deficiency, and the mammillary bodies are affected. So memory, they're gonna have a type of dementia, and it's gonna be the Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, and they're gonna have, it's connected to amygdala and hippocampus and hypothalamus. And then this picture that gives us some of the functions of the cingulate gyrus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and hippocampus for you to review. And then an important thing that I want to mention about the cingulate gyrus, you already know that it's part of the limbic system, and it consists of anterior, middle, and posterior parts, and have extensive functional connectivity with other brain regions, mostly with the frontal lobe. So the seizures arising from the anterior cingulate are characterized by intense fright, like this lady right here, screaming and vocalizations, and autonomic signs and complex gestural and automatisms or hypermotor activity. So it could be related to temporal or to frontal. So seizures that arose from the posterior cingulate, so we talked about the anterior cingulate gyrus, But if they arise from the posterior cingulate gyrus, they can have symptoms suggesting temporal lobe epilepsy with auras like psychic, abdominal, and gustatory. And this is going to be important for seizure localization and semiology, depending on what the patient tells you. Seizure arising from the posterior cingulate shows semiology that vary depending on their spread. So just keep these for when you talk about seizure semiology, and just know that cingulate gyrus has different presentations when there's something happening in the cingulate gyrus. It can present like looking more like frontal seizure or temporal seizures. And seizures arising from the anterior cingulate tend to present with typical features, where those from the posterior cingulate show variable features depending on propagation patterns. So we have gelastic seizures. Since we talked about hypothalamus, gelastic seizures typically arise from hypothalamic hamartomas, which are like tumors in the hypothalamus. And even though we can see laughing in other type of seizures, it's not just for specific for hypothalamic hamartomas, but this is very uh, pathognomonic. I don't know if that's a word. Specific for gelastic seizures, you're going to see the laughing part of the laughing element of the seizure. But it could also occur, the laughing could also occur in seizures that are arising from other regions of the brain. So they usually present in early childhood, like this little girl right here. They are brief, stereotype, and very frequent. And there could be other signs like facial flushing and pupillary dilation, and they might also have be a diachristic component. I want to call it diachristic because there's a cry, so they might cry with the gelastic seizure. Okay, so yeah, just know that the relation and why we put it here, it's because they're related to the hypothalamus, hypothalamic hamartomas. And then memory, it's a complex process that includes encoding, storing, and recalling. So there are going to be different areas of the brain involved in different type of memory. So we have the short-term memory, and this one happens in the prefrontal cortex. And this is going to store information for about 1 minute. And I was thinking, when I was uh, making this presentation, I was thinking like when you are trying to put in the order for the new patient on Revere, and you want to remember what the date of birth or something, because it's a pain in the butt when you have to close the order to type. So you're trying to either memorize it or you write it down. So if you are trying to memorize it, you're using the short-term memory, and that is the one that comes from the prefrontal cortex. Now, the memory that you need to use for the CLTM is the long-term memory. It's this one is processed in the hippocampus and of the temporal lobe, and it's activated when you want to memorize something for a longer time. But I'm pretty sure that once you pass this test, you're gonna forget most of it. Try not to, but yes, there's a region of the brain that says, okay, I don't need this in my storage anymore, let's get rid of it. This memory has unlimited content and duration capacity. It contains personal memories as well as facts and figures. And then we have the skill memory, that I want to call it muscle memory, and it's in the cerebellum. And this one is going to relay information to the basal ganglia. So it's going to store procedural learned memories like tying a shoe, playing an instrument, or riding a bike. So that's what we know as muscle memory. And then if you see in the test post-ictal amnesia, this is going to be because there's a bilateral hippocampal, keep saying hippocampal impairment. And then we have the brain stem. And the brain stem is composed of 3 parts: midbrain, medulla, and the pons. And the midbrain is the part that is on top of your brain stem. So just think about a stem of a plant or flower. And then on top of it is the midbrain that is involved in motor control, eye movement, and processing of vision and hearing. And this is mostly because of the nerves that, the cranial nerves that go through that structure, the midbrain. And then we have the medulla, which is the one that regulates breathing and heart rate, blood pressure, and swallowing. Unfortunately, when a person hangs themselves successfully, this detaches the medulla detaches from the brainstem, which is what causes the death. Pons, the middle portion of your brainstem that coordinates face and face movements, facial sensations, hearing, and balance. And then we have the cerebellum, and this is the little brain or the lesser brain, and this is to coordinate balance and coordinates balance and coordination. Damage to the cerebellum is going to cause ataxia, so you're going to be clumsy walking. And then you're going to have dizziness, you might have shaking or tremors, and double vision. It could make it harder for a person to learn new words or skills. It can interfere with judging the size of a distance from objects, and it can also affect your sense of timing. People with damage to their cerebellum may have trouble repeatedly tapping their fingers like the rhythm. They might do it soon or too late from beat to beat.